G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Hebrews. I pray that it will be of blessing to you and help you in your Christian walk. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session. We are looking at chapter 11, verse 32 to chapter 12, verse 11. Last session, we looked at faith of the Old Testament saints. We looked at the pre-patriarch period, men like Abel and Enoch and Noah. Imagine Noah called to build an ark, a big boat. Never rained before on the earth, and here he is for 120 years. He's building an ark. That took a lot of faith. We see also men like Abraham called out of a land, out of his homeland, and to go to a land where he didn't even know where he was going. He just upped and left and went. And then when he was told which land he's going to be in, God says, this is going to be your land, but yet he lived there as a stranger because he knew that what God said would come to pass. We see Abraham, and Abraham's faith was what gave Sarah the ability to conceive. She became one with Abraham in faith. All the patriarchs, we saw Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of those guys died without receiving the promise of the promised land, but they knew because God had promised that was going to be fulfilled in the future. So they died looking forward to the day when this promise will be fulfilled, and they're going to and they actually will own the promised land in the millennium period. And that showed an endurance of faith. So the patriarchs, they all lived according to faith. They didn't receive the totality of all the promises in their lifetime. But what they did was they saw the future fulfillment. They knew that God was going to fulfill these things, and they believed that God would bring all these promises to pass. Abraham showed faith, magnificent act of faith, when he was called to sacrifice Isaac. Now, why would he have done that? Because he knew God made a promise that through Isaac, through his seed Isaac, he is going to be the father of a multitude. So Abraham knew that if he had sacrificed Isaac, God would have to raise him from the dead. So he was willing to go through with it, but praise God, he didn't have to. But Isaac was as good as dead because he was going to plunge that knife into him. What about Joseph? We saw Joseph down in Egypt. He knew that one day the Jews would leave that land. And he says, listen, he said, I'm going to die, but I want you to take my bones with you back into the promised land, because he knew that what God said was going to happen. So that's Joseph. Moses, Moses, a tremendous act of faith, because, remember, Moses was brought up in the household of Pharaoh's daughter, the princess. In fact, Moses would have been Pharaoh. And so what Moses did was Moses actually gave up his royal life, and he made a choice to side with the people of God, the Jews, and to be ill-treated with them, and so faith sometimes requires a rejection of the world's riches. That's exactly what he did. What about come Passover time? At no time in history was there ever a time when the blood of a lamb protected people in the household. But yet God told God told Moses, this is what you've got to do. Sprinkle blood on the lintels and the doorposts, and he says, your firstborn will be saved. Now, that took a tremendous amount of faith as well. But he did, and it worked. Same as, imagine the people when they got to the Red Sea. Here they are, here's the Red Sea ahead of them, Egyptians behind them, and Moses said, okay, we're going to step into that sea. So it took a bit of faith. The faith is willing to do sometimes things which are unnatural. So we see all those things. We see all these things in the Old Testament, plus many others. What we do know is that without faith, it is impossible to please God. So when we come to God, we need to believe two things. We need to believe that he is. We need to believe that he exists. And that's the first step of faith. And then the second step of faith is that we know that we must believe that he is a rewarder of them that seek after him. That's the recap from last session. Now we're going to continue on from verse 32, and here we're going to see faith in trials. Chapter 11, verse 32 to 38. Now the writer says, and what more shall I say? What more shall I say? So what he says here is, he begins this section with a question, and actually the way it's written here, it's a male voice. It's a masculine. So some people say Priscilla, Aquila's wife, wrote the book of Hebrews, but can't be, because it's a male voice here. Anyway, that's by the by. What more shall I say? In other words, what he's saying is, listen, I can give you a lot more examples of people of faith, of the examples of faith, but he was pretty much running out of time. He said, I can't keep giving you all these examples. These people are all examples of the courage of faith. The point he's making in this chapter is that faith will always be associated with trials. It is natural for faith to be tested. And in fact, if you read the book of James, the Epistle of James, that's a major point in the book of James. Now, since it is natural for faith to be tested, then trials should not nullify faith. In fact, trials, difficulties in life should strengthen faith, because those trials should bring more faith. That's how we exercise our faith when we have difficult times, and that's how we strengthen our faith. And the writer goes on to say, for the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. So he's now showing that faith extended throughout the entire history of Israel. And all he does here, he just picks out some representatives of faith. There were judges like Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. There were kings such as David. There were prophets such as Samuel. And then the writer now presents a couple of triplets for us. He presents three triplets for us. Verse 33 says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises. So the first triplet we see is national victories. First up, they subdued kingdoms. We had Joshua, we had the judges, and we had King David. And secondly, they wrought righteousness. Again, we have David and we have Samuel the prophet. And third, they obtained promises, and these were men like Gideon and Barak and David. That's the first triplet. Second triplet, it says they stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, and escaped the edge of the sword. So this one deals with personal deliverance. First up, they stopped the mouths of lions. Who did that? Well, we see Daniel, Samson, and David. Daniel didn't actually fight a lion. He just was in a lion's den, and their mouths were stopped through faith. Then we see, secondly, they quenched the power of fire, as did the three friends of Daniel when they were put into the furnace. And then third, they escaped the edge of the sword. We see Moses, we see Elijah, Elisha, Jephthah, David. So, the list just goes on. Then from weakness were made strong. They waxed mighty in war. They turned to flight armies of aliens. So this third triplet deals with personal gifts and attainments. So those who from weakness were made strong, we have Gideon, we have Samson, we have David. They waxed mighty in war, as did Joshua, Barak, and David. They turned to flight the armies of aliens. We see that with David and Jehoshaphat. So all examples of faith. Now we see women in verse 35, it says women receive their dead by resurrection. Now in verses 35 to 38, the writer points out here that faith triumphs over death. It pinnacles over death. And he starts out in verse 35, the first part of the verse 35, with a contrast. On one hand, women receive their dead by a resurrection. Well, why women? You realize that in both the Old and the New Testament, most resurrection miracles were on behalf of women. We have the widow of Zarephath, and that was Elijah. Elijah raised her son back to life. And then we had the Shunammite woman, whose son was raised by Elisha. And we had the widow of Nain, whose son was raised by Jesus. And Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, again, Jesus raised him from the dead. So what we see, it was pretty much women received their dead back to life. It says others were tortured, not accepting their deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. So on the other hand now, there were others to whom God promised a better resurrection. Well, how can there be a better resurrection? A resurrection coming back to life would be fantastic enough. A better resurrection means that these resurrections, that these women, with these that we just saw, they were resurrections back to natural life, back to physical life. But so these guys all died again later. Lazarus died again later. And the widow's son died again later. The people God chose not to raise from the dead knew that they would receive a better resurrection. And a better resurrection means an immortal one. Same as will others who were tortured to the point of death, not accepting their deliverance, meaning they did not take the easy way out. They would rather be killed. They could have renounced their faith, such as the three friends of Daniel. They could have escaped being put into the fiery furnace. They were given an option, but they didn't seek the easy way out. They chose to die a physical death for the following reason: that they might obtain a better resurrection, a resurrection back to eternal life. Now, this shows us that it was not God's will to save everyone physically. God does not work the same way in every case. There were some people he resurrected from the dead, but others he did not resurrect from the dead. There were some he rescued alive, while there were others he allowed to be tortured to death. Those who were tortured to death exercised as much faith as those who were rescued alive. All of these had faith, although the results of their faith actually varied according to what God had willed. And then in verse 36 to 38, and others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder. That's verse 36 and part of verse 37 here. In verses 36 to 38, the writer to the Hebrews is showing them that the triumph of faith onto death caused a higher victory, which was a triumph over death itself. And he lists various ways that people suffered because of their faith. Some endured mockings and scourgings, Jeremiah, for instance. Some endured bonds and imprisonments, well, Joseph, patriarch Joseph. Some were stoned, Zechariah was stoned. Some were sawn asunder, sawn in half, perhaps Isaiah. This is a Jewish tradition. It claims, a Jewish tradition here claims that Isaiah was sawn in half by King Manasseh. Now, it's a tradition, Not sure whether it's actual fact or not. They were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and the holes of the earth. So this, one thing this does tell us here is that, to be a follower of God does not guarantee you red carpet treatment. You don't stay in 5-star accommodation. So what we see here is that some were tempted, as was Joseph with Potiphar's wife. Some were slain with a sword. Uriah was slain with a sword. King Jehoiakim, in the days of Jeremiah, struck him down. There was a spelling mistake in your PowerPoint. It wasn't Uriah, it was Uriah. Some wandered about in sheepskins and in goatskins. Well, that's Elijah, and Elisha followed after. So did John the Baptist, for instance. Some were destitute, afflicted, and tormented, as were the prophets. Some wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and the holes of the earth, as did Obadiah. That was a friend of Elijah. Remember, Obadiah was the one who was he was in charge of King Ahab's palace, and he hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves and fed them. So that's what Obadiah. And the author here states that of all these people, the world was not worthy. So, these people who were destitute, who were tormented, who were afflicted, who wandered about in strange clothes in the deserts, of all these people, the world was not worthy. All of these people had points of similarity with the readers. They too, these Hebrews, they too had forfeited employment, and they too were ostracized from society. They were reduced to poverty. They were mocked, they were imprisoned, and on it goes. Nevertheless, no one of these Hebrew believers had as yet given his life for the faith. So this is what he's saying here. There are points of similarity. Remember, this letter is all about these Hebrews who were being persecuted, wanting to escape persecution. And let's just head back into Judaism for a while until it all blows over. We'll come back out again following Jesus. So the writer is here saying, listen, have a look at all these guys, mate. All these things that have gone on before, you guys have gone through the same thing. And these all, having had witness borne to them through their faith, verse 39, receive not the promise, God having provided some better thing concerning us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Now, these 2 verses, verse 39 to 40, gives us the victory of faith. And these 2 verses here, we have the summary and the conclusion of the entire chapter, chapter 11. All who have had faith and have shown their faith in these ways will have a share in the kingdom. Those who died in the past will not live again until the kingdom is established, and yet they all anticipated the fulfillment of God's promise. They waited for it by faith with patient endurance. By way of application here, the writers, the Hebrews, the writers, the ones who are reading this epistle, must also have patient endurance until they see the fulfillment. They are to lay hold on the promise by faith and to show it by patient endurance. And that expectation could sustain them as it sustained all the fathers who went before them. In verse 39, it says there that the fulfillment is still future. These all having had witness borne to them concerning their faith. They really had faith, although they did not receive the fulfillment of the promise in their lifetime. Now, certain personal promises were fulfilled in their day, but the Old Testament saints, for instance, did not receive the national and messianic promises and prophecies. And nevertheless, they had witness borne to them of their faith. They foresaw that these promises would be fulfilled in the future, and they died in faith with the full expectation that they're going to have it. They still possessed their faith when they died. They didn't shrink back. Now, why did God allow the Old Testament saints to die before his promises were fulfilled? Well, verse 40. The answer is that there is a unity in God's program. God having provided some better thing concerning us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. When he says better thing concerning us, it means him and the Hebrew believers that he's writing to. And now it includes us as well. Now, if God had fulfilled the Messianic kingdom promises to the Old Testament saints in their lifetime, then there would be nothing for present believers to anticipate. You know, their kingdom coming. It's already been fulfilled. Now, since the Messianic kingdom promises have not yet been fulfilled, both the Old Testament and the New Testament believers can anticipate the same thing, a future Messianic kingdom where Messiah will sit on the throne and rule and reign from Jerusalem. There's something waiting for all believers in the future. And when the author states that apart from us, they should not be made perfect, what he means here is that the Old Testament and New Testament saints should eventually reach their perfection together. Eventually, all will receive their ultimate sanctification, which is glorification. And that will happen together at the second coming of Jesus. By then, all the faithful will be resurrected, since all believers are part of the first resurrection. In chapter 12, verse 23, when we get there, we're going to see that the author will refer to the Old Testament saints as just men made perfect. But the ultimate perfection will actually come with the Messianic kingdom. The Old Testament saints are the people the readers are to imitate in keeping with what the writer already said back in chapter 6, verse 12. That you should not be sluggish, but imitators of them who through faith and patience inherits the promises. So these saints, they persevered through their trials and disappointments by exercising patient endurance, which was the evidence of their faith. And the author has pointed out many times that his readers possess faith. They possess the faith. Now they're to use their faith by showing patient endurance, as did the Old Testament saints. It will come better. It might be the future. It might not be this lifetime, but there will be a better time. And while the original recipients of this letter were indeed suffering, their sufferings did not equal the sufferings of those who had gone before. And if faith sustained their ancestors, it certainly would sustain them, and it will also sustain us as well. We're into chapter 12, and this is the exhortation to endurance of faith. In verses 1 to 11, we're going to see faith and discipline. Let's look at verses 1 to 2 first up. This is the incentives to endurance, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12. Therefore, let us also, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So now the writer gives them two incentives for exercising patient endurance. First incentive we find in verse 1, And it comes from the list of the heroes of the faith found in chapter 11. Therefore, let us also, seeing we're encompassed with such a great cloud of witnesses, because of what he said back in chapter 11, therefore, the believers here are now seen as contestants striving to win a prize. While the believers here are in the arena or in the stadium, these Old Testament saints are sitting in the bleachers like rows of spectators. That's the picture he's giving here. The competitors, the believers are in the stadium, they're on the pitch, and the Old Testament saints are in the bleachers looking on like spectators. But they're not spectators. They're not in the sense that they're watching the believers to see how well they're doing, but in the sense that sitting in the bleachers, they are witnessing to the believers in the arena concerning the life of faith. What they're saying is, have a look at us. They bear witness to the sufficiency of faith, and they demonstrate, sitting in the bleachers, they demonstrate that faith will produce patient endurance, and it will result in obedience, and will accept trials without wavering, and that by the exercise of faith and patient endurance, they can win the race. What they're saying is, have a look at us. We've done it. So it's not the spectators who are doing the looking, it's the contestants on the pitch are the ones doing the looking. They're looking back at the ones in the bleachers and saying, hey, these guys all made it, therefore we can do it. Now, don't take this verse to mean that those in heaven can see what is happening down here on earth. That's not what it's saying. Now, when the writer states compassed about, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. So when he says compassed about, he's saying that the heroes of the faith that we saw back in chapter 11 are to be in the minds of the contestants. The contestants are to be aware of what these heroes accomplished through faith and the exercise of patient endurance. Now, of the two Greek words for cloud, the one he uses here does not mean a single cloud, just one cloud in the sky, but it means a mass. It's a dense group of clouds. And that's why the text reads, so great a cloud. The point here is that they are to keep in mind a large mass, a dense group of people who should serve as witnesses that the race can be won by faith and patient endurance. Lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. The writer now goes on to give three participles that show how to prepare for the race. These three participles emphasize the putting aside of everything that prevents one from running the race well. And the first participle reads, having or seeing we're compassed about. So seeing, it involves seeing the faith of the saints of chapter 11 and seeing that this faith must now be imitated. So look at the faith of those that we've just talked about and now imitate that. Second participle is laying aside. And this Greek word means, it refers to anything that will keep one from freely running the race. Anything that will divert their attention away from freely running the race must be set aside. Now, in the context in which he's writing here, back in, which we found back in chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, the Judaism for these Hebrew believers is now excess weight that needs to be set aside, right? Remember, they wanted to go back into Judaism. What the writer is saying, no, mate, that's a hindrance to you. Put that aside. Put it aside. You are now to run the race with faith and patience, endurance. Get rid of that hindrance. Put it aside. For a runner, especially if you're running a marathon, which is what the believer is running, weight can be either excess body fat or it could be a burdensome load. And so the words lay aside convey the idea of you're taking off a robe. If one is to reach the goal in the race that had been begun, it is necessary to lay aside any encumbrance. Just get rid of the stuff, mate. Get rid of all that baggage. So now the contestant will train down to a desired weight, and he'll lay aside garments that might impede his progress. And the third participle is looking, but that's in verse 2. When we get there, we'll look at that. This is the manner in which they must run the race. Now, the phrase, the sin which does so easily beset us, it gives insight here into what these readers need to lay aside, because the sin, if committed, will be the cause of their failure. Now, this phrase has the definite article. It is not just any sin, but it is the sin. It's a specific sin. And for these Hebrew believers, it is a sin of apostasy. The sin would be if they went back into Judaism. And back in chapter 10, verse 38 to 39, it says that if we shrink back, but the writer is encouraging him. He says, but we're not of them that are going to shrink back into perdition. So what he's saying is, don't go back into that Judaism. Now, for other people, it may be another sin that will throw them off the spiritual path. But for these guys, it was a sin of apostasy, which would have been them shrinking back from faith into the old ways of Judaism. The word translated besets or ensnares is another term for it, is a compound that literally reads, or literally means, to stand around us and to encircle us. So just as the runner, just as a contestant in the middle of the arena is surrounded by a multitude who bear witness to the validity of faith, so unbelief also surrounds us and entices us to abandon faith. So it's a battle going on. The moment the contestant loses his assurance that he will complete the race, he then begins to doubt that he'll be able to finish it. And he can easily give up. The obligation here is to lay the sin aside and to keep on running. Lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. Let us run with patience the race set before us. Let us run, that's present tense. It means let us keep on running. The race is long and they must run with endurance. It's a marathon race. How long is it? It goes from the day of salvation onto the day of death. It's a long race for many. It's a lifelong marathon. And the Greek word for race is the origin of the English word agony. So this race is an agonizing race. And the manner in which it must be run is with patient endurance. And the word patience means it's a steady determination to keep going. And they must continue in spite of a desire to slow down or quit. And they must keep running until the end of their lives. And so the author does not exhort that we run with faith, but that we run with patient endurance by faith. Here's a second incentive, and this is the what we see in verse 2. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So here in verse 2, we have the second incentive, which is the sufferings of Messiah himself, sufferings of Jesus himself. And here the writer will emphasize the attitude that they must have as they run this agonizing race. They must have the same attitude of patient endurance as Jesus himself had. And here we find the third participle, which is looking, but the Greek meaning is stronger than just having a quick glance or having a look. The meaning is to look away from all distractions. So we're looking away from all distractions, and now we must keep our eyes fixed upon the one thing, which is the finish line. We need to focus upon the finish line. And in this case, the finish line is onto Jesus. So we need to be looking onto Jesus. That's the finish line. And notice here that he uses his human name. Why? Because the focus of the writer is on Jesus's experience as a man, especially his experiences in the endurance of pain, humiliation, and the shame of the cross. And because the author had referred to so many Old Testament saints in chapter 11 who ran with patient endurance, readers might be tempted to use, someone like Joseph as an ideal example, or, maybe David, King David. However, almost all of those cited as witnesses to the life of faith also had failures, so that they would not be perfect examples. However, Jesus is the perfect example of obedience and patient endurance. If we have a look here at First Peter chapter 2, verses 21 to 23, Peter writes this: "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." So Jesus is the ultimate example, not the witnesses. Why? Because Jesus is the author and perfecter of faith, their faith and our faith. Now, the word author, this shows him to be the pioneer or the chief leader of their faith. Back in chapter 2, verse 10, the writer of Hebrews used the same word when he emphasized Jesus to be the author of salvation. So Jesus is the author of their spiritual salvation. How do they gain it? By saving faith. But the faith the writer is now dealing with is the principle of faith, which the readers live the spiritual life. Jesus is also the author of that kind of faith as well. And this Greek word is actually used in different ways and can mean author, pioneer, chief leader, example, originator. So there's a few of them there. So Jesus is all of these. Also, he is the perfecter of their faith. Now, by perfecter, the writer means that Jesus is the finisher of their faith. Jesus is the finisher in the sense of completing it. He is the complete example of faith. And the Greek word for perfecter means one who carries it through to completion. So not only is Jesus the beginner of the faith they need to use in living out the daily spiritual life, but if they patiently endure, he will also bring it to completion. And the fact that Jesus is referred to as both the initiator of faith and the one who brings faith to its fullest expression emphasizes the perfect example of the one to whom we are encouraged to look. There's no greater example of patient endurance and suffering than Jesus, both in his trial and in his crucifixion. In fact, the prophet Isaiah said of him, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. That's we can find it in Isaiah 53 verse 7. Now, what we see here is that the thing that what motivated Jesus, the thing that motivated Jesus in his suffering was the joy that was set before him. His great joy was of submitting himself unreservedly to the will of his Father. His joy sprang from his obedience. Paul referred to this when he wrote, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. That's in Philippians 2 verse 8. Philippians 2 verse 8. So at this point, the writer shows how Jesus was the example who for the joy that was set before him. So Jesus was willing to suffer all that he did because in front of his eyes, as he was looking to what was ahead in the distance, was the goal, which for him was the joy set before him. And the joy set before him included two things. First, he would sit at the right hand of the Father and be restored to glory. And we find it in John 17 verse 5. God honored the obedience and the patient endurance of his Son by enthroning him at his own right hand. Paul says that the consequence of Jesus' obedience was that God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, those in heaven, those on the earth. Again, Philippians 2, verses 9 to 11. Now, the second thing is that he would accomplish the salvation of the lost, Isaiah 53:11. And so because he had this goal as his finish line, he was looking ahead to the finish line, the joy set before him, he therefore patiently endured everything in between, which included the cross. The word cross, which we see here in the Greek text, does not have the definite article. It is not the cross, but simply endured cross. And this emphasizes not how Jesus died, but the nature of his death. Jesus died a shameful death. Of all the ways that Jesus could have died, this type of death was the most shameful of all. And this shameful death was in contrast to the joy that he had in heaven. So when Jesus was on the cross, he both began and finished the work of salvation. The salvation work of redemption, propitiation, and reconciliation was accomplished by him on the cross. Jesus endured this shameful death on the cross because he knew what it would accomplish, and so he exercised patient endurance. And the readers should be willing to endure suffering for Jesus because he endured the cross for them. Although he knew death on the cross was a shameful death, he despised the shame and accepted his death willingly. Because he did all of this, Jesus attained his joy and attained salvation for us. And then he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And the Greek tense used here for the word sat is a perfect tense. That means that he sat down in the past at the right hand of God, and he's still sitting there witnessing to an accomplished work. Therefore, his joy is now complete. We see the measure of endurance in verses 3 to 4. For consider him that had endured such gainsaying of sinners against himself, that you wax not weary, fainting in your souls. You have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. So here the writer points out to his readers how far they may and should be willing to go in their suffering on behalf of Jesus and in their exercise of patient endurance. He begins in verse 3, giving the example of endurance. For consider him. And so the thought that now comes to the reader's mind in verse 2 is that as he thought about Messiah's suffering, it now leads to this exhortation of endurance. And the Greek word for consider here means to reason up. It's the origin of the English word analogy. It was used in Greek literature for adding up a column of figures to get a grand total. And so the writer here uses the word consider to give the readers total picture of Jesus' suffering. Now and then, believers need to review point by point in detail every part of the sufferings that led to Messiah's death. And then we need to construct a mental analogy of the trials and the sufferings of Jesus. At that point, they will note that Jesus endured vocal ridicule. He endured such gainsaying of sinners. They need to remember what Jesus endured, because then they'll not become weary, fainting in their souls. So by contemplating the sufferings he endured, what he suffered and how much he suffered, they'll realize our sufferings and their sufferings are quite mild. And this will help to eliminate any mental and psychological discouragement in the midst of any sufferings that we go through. And this is especially true since he suffered as a sinless being and suffered on their behalf. So how much should they be willing to suffer? How much should we be willing to suffer? Verse 4. Verse 4 spells out the extent of endurance. You have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. So none of the group members to whom he's writing have yet suffered unto death. The church in Jerusalem had experienced the deaths of Stephen and James, but these guys, he was writing to the churches of Judea, which were outside Jerusalem. While they'd suffered a great deal, none of them at this time had suffered as a martyr. You have not resisted unto blood, striving against sin. The word resist here in verse 4 is a military term that means to stand in opposition to the enemy on the battle line. So the believer should be willing to stand on the battle line and shed their blood. So even if it means they must die a physical death, they need to be willing to die striving against sin. And the Greek word for striving is the word agony, and its more complete form is antagonism. So they need to be these guys need to be so antagonistic to sin that they're willing to die in their stand against it. And so the root word is the same as the word for race. It's agony. It's they need to run this race even to the point of being so antagonistic to sin that they're willing to be martyred. Now here we see the purpose of suffering in verses 5 to 11. We'll just read 5 and 6 first. And you have forgotten the exhortation which reasons with you as with sons. My son, regard not lightly the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved of him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. The author's basic point here is that the purpose of suffering is to bring about maturity of God's children. And he gives specifics on how to attain that goal. Starting out here in these two verses, he speaks against forgetfulness. The problem is that they have forgotten the exhortation which reasons with you as with sons. So he affirms here they have forgotten something. And the word means they've made of little account. He reminds them that, listen, you guys are sons of God. And he shows now that discipline comes from a father-son relationship. In fact, the fact that he calls them sons here shows that they are believers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sons of God. But it is because they're sons of God that they're going to be disciplined. That's what a natural father-son relationship happens. That's what happens. And then in 5 to 6, he also quotes Proverbs 3:11 to 12 to prove two things. First thing, the writer proves that God disciplines those whom he loves. And secondly, he proves that discipline is a sign of sonship. And they must learn two lessons from Proverbs. The first lesson to be learned is that they must not disregard or not regard this discipline lightly to the point of forgetting it and not allowing the discipline to teach them. Second lesson is that they should not faint in the sense of giving up and collapsing because of the discipline they receive from God. Now, punishment is retribution for evil. And for the believer, for you and I as believers, the punishment has already been received by Jesus on the cross. Discipline, on the other hand, is for moral training to conform us or conform the son to what the father expects of the son. And for believers, there will be degrees of discipline, not in kind, but actually in intensity. The progression of discipline is from a lesser degree to a greater degree. And the progression is weakness, sickness, and finally death, which we see in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 30. It says, that is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. So we have weakness, sickness, death. The Greek to reprove in regard to discipline is to use the spirit, the word, to convict. To discipline, weakness and illness, and then to scourge is death. Verse 7, it is for chastening that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father chastens not? So he applies now the Old Testament lesson to their situation. And the efficacy of the discipline, or the effectiveness of the discipline, is giving them, that God is giving them, depends upon the spirit in which they're willing to receive it. The word chasten means moral training, to train up a child. So here the writer is reaffirming that God is dealing with them as with sons, and sons are chastened. This is not punishment for the sake of punishment, but it is punishment for the sake of correction. So God disciplines because he needs to use corrective measures. And they're suffering chastisement right now in their present situation, which is where they are in Judea. God is chastising them because they are sons, and they need to pass through this chastisement with patient endurance. And the principle here is, for what son is there whom his father chastens not? So having set down this principle, he now gives a two-step argument. But if you are without chastening, whereof all have been made partakers, then are you bastards and not sons? So it says, but if you are. So if chastening is not present, if they're never disciplined, it will show them to be illegitimate and prove they're not true sons. However, what we see here is they have all become partakers of sonship because of their chastisement. And this is evident that they are sons. And for this reason, the chastening should be personally accepted and should permanently take effect in their day-to-day living. When chastening is absent, it shows they're illegitimate, they're not God's children. An illegitimate child does not have the rights of an heir. Illegitimacy leaves one without rights as an heir to the father's fortune, and then deprives him of his father's care. And under Jewish law, to be a mamzer, or to be illegitimate, meant three things. There's no right of inheritance, no right to marry into Jewish society, and no right to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. Verse 9. Furthermore, we had the fathers of our flesh to chasten us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? Here's the second step in the argument. Here the writer wants to, furthermore, he says he wants to point out that the spirit in which discipline must be born. And he gives an illustration of the human family. After all, we all had fathers of our flesh to discipline us. And even human fathers, in spite of that, discipline us, and in spite of that discipline, which was tough for some, the believers learned to give their human fathers reverence. And the application of the illustration is, and we gave them reverence, shall we not much rather be in subjection of the Father of spirits and live? So since the believers were willing to subject themselves to human fathers, how much more should they be willing to subject themselves to their heavenly Father, and therefore exercise patient endurance by voluntary submission? And the object of their submission is the Father of spirits, which emphasizes him as the creator of the immaterial part of man. It's the immaterial part of man that continues to live after physical death. And the result is that they shall live. So one product of divine discipline is the abundant life now enjoyed in fellowship with God the Father. There is enjoyment of life while the believer is still on earth. And this is again a Jewish, it's called a Calvachomer, Kalvechomer, Calvachomer. It's an argument that goes from lesser to greater. The argument here is that if they learn to respect their human fathers when they discipline them, well, how much more should they subject themselves to the Father of spirits and live? Okay, the second product of God's discipline is holiness in this life. In verse 10, the writer makes a contrast between two types of fathers, human one, heavenly one. For they indeed for a few days chastened us as human fathers as seemed good to them. Now, human discipline had two aspects. First, as it is applied to the children, it was temporary. It was temporal. It was only for a few days, for the days they were growing up. Second, as it applied to the fathers, they practiced it as it seemed good to them. However, in the case of human fathers, their exercise of discipline was not always perfect. Human fathers are not always right, and sometimes they make mistakes and wrongfully punish their children. And then go on in second part of verse 10, but he for our profit that we may be partakers of his holiness. The divine Father never makes mistakes. Every time he disciplines, it is for a purpose. It is for our profit. What is our profit? The writer answers, he says that we may be partakers of his holiness. So this is the second product of God's discipline, if accepted with patient endurance, holiness in this life, and that's the essential character of the person. Verse 11, all chastening seems for the present to be not joyous, but grievous. Yet afterward it yields peaceable fruit unto them that have been exercised thereby, even the fruit of righteousness. So the writer there concludes this section of his argument by pointing out that God's divine purpose is accomplished through sorrow, just as human discipline is accompanied by sorrow. And after the believers endure divine discipline with the right spirit, take it the right way, with patient endurance and faith, there'll be two results. And the first result will be peaceable fruit. A rebellious spirit will now change to a submissive spirit. The second result is that practical righteousness is produced in those who experience discipline. And here the author uses the same word as back in chapter 5, verse 14, for exercised, which shows the purpose of divine discipline is to bring the believer to maturity. It is true that at the time of discipline, all discipline is painful, but in the end, it produces the peaceable fruit of righteousness in those who experience it. Discipline is not joyous. It is grievous when the believers suffer it. Nevertheless, the end product is a good thing, and it will be external evidence of the holiness of verse 10. And this is the relationship of faith and discipline. In the next section we're going to look at, next session is the faith and the believer's obligations, and that's going to take us chapter 12, verse 12 to chapter 12, verse 29. And that's our lot for this week. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.